Good morning, guys. Happy Monday. It is April 20th, and this week we are covering TCI Lesson 17, Sections 1 and 2 only. So there are 3 sections within TCI Lesson 17, but we're going to be looking at Section 3 next week. So you guys do not have to worry about that one quite yet. Our topic this week is on the decline of feudalism. We're going to look at some of the causes as to what forced the feudal system to break down and why we transition into a new social system, a new form of government. So this week is set up pretty similar to how you guys have been working in the past. So your first step is to either read TCI Lesson 17 independently or to continue watching the video lecture after I've gone through and done our Lesson 16 review. After you finish that up, you're going to respond to the discussion board for this lesson, like usual. But this week, you guys have an additional assignment as well. That will be to complete Magna Carta primary doc analysis and then submit the assignment on Schoology. I will show you what that looks like in just a second, but both of your assignments will be due Friday by 11:59 like usual. Okay, so if you guys head to Schoology, go into this week's folder. Obviously, these will be available once I post the video. So you have your Lesson 17 discussion board. Again, that's nothing new. You have fewer questions though, because again, we're only looking at 2 particular sections. So for section 1, what was the Magna Carta and what compromise did it lead to? And number 2, what was the model parliament and why was it created? Section 2, you guys will be responding to these 2 questions. Number 1, how did people become infected with the plague? And 2, list examples of how the outbreak of the bubonic plague in Europe contributed to the decline of feudalism and the rise of democratic thought. Please remember to put these in one post. I don't want 4 different posts for each individual question, and please make sure that you are using complete sentences when you are answering these questions below. After you have finished up your discussion board, you're going to head back to the week of April 20th, and you're going to click into the Magna Carta primary source analysis. So because this is an assignment on Schoology, it's going to create a Google Doc for you within your own drive. From there, you'll be able to edit that document. It'll look like this. And then please make sure that you remember to submit it to me on Schoology so that I get notified, and then I am able to grade you on your assignment as well. So I will go over what I would like to see from this document in a little bit at the end of our video after I've gone through the content with you guys first. Excuse me, guys. I'm going to grab a drink of water real quick. All right, sorry about that. So like I said, at the end of the video lecture, we are going to come back together, look at this document. I will walk you guys through it. I know it looks like a lot right now, but it is not too tricky. It's broken down, it's simplified so that you guys will be able to read the text, hopefully pretty well, that you guys will be able to understand the purpose, why these terms were included in the Magna Carta after reading the background on each article. And then after you have looked at the different sections, you guys have a couple of questions to go along with each one. Okay, so there are only 3 different articles or 3 different sections of the Magna Carta that we will be looking at. You guys have 4 questions after each one of those. Okay, so it's important that you guys type your responses into the Google Doc. And then again, please make sure that you submit this document when you are completely finished, okay? If you are someone who prefers to read TCI independently rather than listen to the video lecture, it might help you out to, pause it, go read your TCI, and then maybe when it comes time to work on this Google Doc, that you guys play the video so you can listen to my explanation so that we can kind of walk through some of this background some of this primary document together. Okay. Before we get to lesson 17, though, we're quickly going to go over the discussion board questions from lesson 16. All right, so section 1. You guys were asked, what contributed to the growth of towns in medieval Europe? Improved farming methods and the revival of trade contributed to the growth of towns. You could have said something along those lines. Section 2, what were guilds and why were they established? Guilds were organizations of people who practiced the same craft or organizations of merchants. They were set up to make sure their members were treated fairly and kept high standards for their work. Section 3, how did trade change from the beginning of the Middle Ages to the High Middle Ages? So early in the Middle Ages, people traded in luxury goods, which only the wealthy could afford. Later, more local people were trading more and more kinds of goods, including everyday items such as food and clothing. So that really allowed people the opportunity to specialize more in particular crafts. So, you wouldn't have to spend all of your time creating clothing for your family to wear, or, farming the food to feed your family, because now you might be able to trade for some of those things. And it gave people more time. It gave them more opportunity to specialize in a particular trade, in a particular craft. So maybe you have, more masters of specific trades. Section 4 asked you to describe a typical home in a medieval town. Most homes in medieval towns were small, crowded, and built of wood. The homes of the wealthy were much larger. However, they are still not what you would consider to be like a wealthy mansion nowadays. Because keep in mind, these medieval towns are very, very unsanitary. There was still no indoor plumbing. Houses were very, very dark, very, very dingy. Again, there's no common place for trash or for people to use the restroom. So typically that would end up in the streets, or that would end up in creeks or nearby rivers. Okay, so again, all in all, just not very sanitary, not very hygienic, not a super glamorous time period, if you will. Section 5, you guys had 2 questions. Number 1, what were some of the common diseases in medieval Europe, and how did doctors try to treat them? Some common diseases in medieval Europe were measles and the bubonic plague. Medieval doctors would use prayer, magic, and herbal medicines to try to treat their patients. Bloodletting, including the use of leeches, was also very, very popular, but like we know now, that actually ended up doing more harm than good for the patients. According to the video, what were the 3 major causes of the plague? Increased international trade, rising urban populations, so bigger cities, and lack of medical knowledge all contributed to that vast spread of the plague. Section 6, describe the 2 methods for determining the guilt or innocence of accused criminals during the early Middle Ages. 2 methods were trial by ordeal, in which the accused had to pass a dangerous test, and trial by combat, in which the accused had to fight to prove his or her innocence, or could have someone fight for him or her. Section 7, what were some popular children's games in medieval Europe? Children played with dolls and toys such as wooden swords and hobby horses. They also rolled hoops and played lawn bowling and blind man's bluff. All right, so we are now moving on to lesson 17, the decline of feudalism. Again, we are only looking at sections 1 and 2, so I'm going to do my best to move through these pretty quickly so that we can get to our primary document analysis at the end without taking up too much of your Monday here. So our essential question for this lesson: how did events in Europe contribute to the decline of feudalism and the rise of democratic thought? Our 3 objectives. Number 1, describe significant medieval English legal and constitutional developments, such as Magna Carta and the establishment of Parliament, and their impact on feudalism. Number 2, analyze how the bubonic plague spread from Central Asia to Europe and evaluate the impact it had on the population of Europe and on feudalism. And lastly, number 3, summarize the impact of the 100 Years' War on feudalism in Europe. We will not get to our third objective until next week when we visit section 3. All right, so at this point, if you are interested in independently reading TCI, you guys can pause the video. But again, I would probably come back and, fast forward to the document analysis if you feel like you need some extra help working through those articles. All right, so let's begin with our introduction on the decline of feudalism. Several key events contributed to the decline of feudalism in Europe from the 12th through the 15th centuries. We're going to be looking at these 3 key events, these 3 contributions to the decline. They are political changes in England, a terrible disease, otherwise known as the bubonic plague, and a long series of wars. So starting with those political changes in England, these changes take place in the 12th and 13th centuries and help to weaken feudalism. Probably the biggest impact will be through a famous document known as Magna Carta, or Great Charter, which dates from this time period. Magna Carta was a written legal agreement that severely limited the king's power and strengthened the rights of nobles. We'll look at that in more depth in a few slides. The second of these causes is a terrible disease called the bubonic plague that made its way through Europe in the 1300s. Over the next 2 centuries, this terrifying disease ended up killing millions of people in Europe. And it's because of this severe loss of life that Europe really has to restructure its social classes, its economy, and you'll find that common people start to get more rights as a result. And then lastly, between 1337 and 1453, France and England fight a series of battles known as the 100 Years' War. This conflict changed the way that wars were fought, and it also shifted power away from feudal lords to monarchs and the common people. Okay, so that's just kind of an intro to what we will be looking at over the course of the next 2 weeks. And we are going to get started with section 1, which is political developments in England. So political development was really, really prevalent during the Middle Ages, and in one country specifically, England. These developments are really going to help weaken feudalism. The story actually begins with King Henry II, who was in power from 1154 to 1189. Henry made legal reform a central concern of his reign. So in his time in power, he really wanted to focus on legal reform. For example, he insisted that a jury formally accuse a person of a serious crime. Cases would then be tried before a royal judge. So in theory, people could no longer simply be jailed or executed for no legal reason, but they had to go through a court trial as well. These reforms strengthened the power of royal courts at the expense of those feudal lords, because prior to Henry II, it was really those feudal lords that were tasked with, hearing the crimes and then determining the fates of these particular people. Henry's effort to strengthen royal authority, however, led to a serious conflict with the Catholic Church. In the year 1164, Henry issued the Constitutions of Clarendon, which was a document that he claimed spelled out the king's traditional rights. So the rights that Henry said that he possessed because, they're the rights, they're the power that a monarch has always had. It's tradition. It was common. So he claimed that he had certain rights. Among them was the right to try clergy, so those members of a church who are accused of serious crimes in royal courts rather than in church courts themselves. Henry's action led to a long and bitter quarrel with his friend named Thomas Becket, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury. In 1170, four knights who were probably seeking the king's favor, so they wanted to be in good graces with King Henry, they killed Becket in front of the main altar of Canterbury Cathedral, which is pictured over here on the right. So the cathedral and Becket's tomb actually became a popular destination for pilgrimages. In 1173, the Catholic Church proclaimed him a saint. But still, in spite of all of that, most of the constitutions of Clarendon remained in force. So those rights, those traditional rights that Henry claimed that he had and, spelled out in the constitutions of Clarendon, they persisted. They continued. So in 1199, Henry's youngest son, John, became the King of England. John made very, very powerful enemies because he lost most of the lands that the English had controlled in France, and he also taxed his barons or his lords very, very heavily and ignored their traditional rights. And he would arrest his opponents at will. He would not give them trial. And in addition, John quarreled. He had more difficulties with the Catholic Church, and he typically collected large amounts of money from its properties as well. In June of 1215, angry nobles forced a meeting with King John in a meadow called Runnymede, which was located right outside of London. There, they essentially forced John to put his royal seal on a document called Magna Carta, which means Great Charter in Latin. When it says put his seal on the document, essentially that means that he's agreeing to it. He's on board with it. He is signing his name, agreeing to the terms that are listed. So again, he was rather forced into signing the Magna Carta because he wanted to avoid a civil war. He wanted to avoid further conflict with his barons or with his nobles. So what is the Magna Carta? What is this document that King John was forced to affix his seal? Well, the Magna Carta was an agreement between the nobles and the monarch. The nobles concurred that the monarch could continue rule. So they agreed that King John could continue to act as King of England. For his part, however, King John had to agree to observe common law and the traditional rights of the nobles and the church. So, for example, he promised to consult the nobles and the church archbishops before imposing special taxes. So before he decided to tax any nobles or any church officials, he had to first get their approval as well. He also agreed that no free man could be jailed except by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of England. And it's actually this idea that eventually developed into a key part of English common law, which is known as habeas corpus. Habeas corpus is the legal concept that an accused person cannot be jailed indefinitely without being charged with a crime. Okay, so this also persists in US legal practices as well. Okay, so you have to be charged with a crime. You cannot just be held in a jail without being formally charged, without being informed of why you are being held there. Okay, so in many ways, the Magna Carta only protected the rights and privileges of nobles. So at this point, the Magna Carta didn't really say a whole lot as to the rights that were potentially being violated, the rights of those common people. However, as time passed, the English people came to regard it as one of the foundations of their rights and liberties. So this document is actually going to be incredibly influential in the future, not only for the English, but even in terms of the United States as well. Magna Carta is often cited as one of the most important legal documents in the history of democracy. So that's why we're going to be analyzing this primary document at the end of this lesson, because it is really, really important. It has had a lasting impact on democracies to come. Okay, this is just kind of one of the foundations. This is one of the stepping stones to setting up a democracy. So next, we're going to look at King Edward I and Parliament. In 1295, Edward I, who was actually King John's grandson, took a major step toward including more people in government. Okay, so even though the Magna Carta applied solely to those high-ranking church officials and nobles, we do have some future monarchs who take steps to include more people, all types of people in government. Edward called together a governing body called the Model Parliament that included commoners and lower-ranking clergy, as well as high-level church officials and nobles. So we're going to talk about why this is so influential. These political changes contributed to the decline of feudalism in two ways. Number one, some of the changes strengthened royal authority at the expense of the nobles. So it severely weakened the power that the nobility had. Others eventually shifted some power to the common people. Magna Carta established the idea of rights and liberties that even a monarch cannot violate. This document also affirmed that monarchs should rule with the advice of the governed. Henry II's legal reform strengthened English common law and the role of both judges and juries. And finally, Edward I's model parliament gave a voice in government to common people, as well as to nobles. All these ideas formed the basis for the development of modern democratic institutions. So, of course, when we say democratic, we are talking about the principle, the form of government by which the people have a voice. They are able to, elect representatives to make and carry out laws. They are ruled by the people. Okay, so moving on to section 2, we're going to go through this one pretty quick because, again, you guys have already been exposed to this content on the bubonic plague. So in addition to political developments in England, another reason for the decline of feudalism was the bubonic plague, which affected all of Europe. The bubonic plague first struck Europe from 1346 to 1351. And it returns in waves that occurred about every decade into the 15th century, leaving behind a lot of change as well. Historians suspect that the plague began in Central Asia and spread throughout China, India, and the Middle East, and eventually making its way into Europe. The disease traveled from Central Asia to the Black Sea along the Silk Road, which, again, as a reminder to you guys, was the main trading route between Asia and the Mediterranean Sea. It was probably carried to Italy on a ship, causing it to spread north and west throughout the continent of Europe and eventually making its way up to England. So, symptoms or signs of the plague often included fever, vomiting, fierce coughing, and sneezing. In addition, there would be egg-sized swellings or bumps that would come to form on the skin of its victims. The dirty conditions in which people lived contributed significantly to the spread of the bubonic plague. The bacteria that cause the disease were carried by fleas that feed on the blood of infected rodents. When the animals die, the fleas jump onto other animals and to people as well. So during the Middle Ages, it was not unusual for people to go for many months, I will say it again, many months without changing their clothing, or taking a bath. Rodents covered with fleas often roamed the floors of homes looking for food. And again, city streets were filled with human waste, dead animals, and trash, which often lured in those infected rodents. So at this time, no one really knew where the disease came from or how it spread. So as a result, terrified people falsely blamed the plague on anything from the positions of the planets to lepers or even Jews as well. Some historians estimate that about 24 million Europeans died of the plague, which was about 1/3 of the entire population. The deaths of so many people accelerated or sped up changes in Europe's economic and social structure, which is actually what contributes to the decline of feudalism. So the impact of the plague on feudalism. Trade and commerce slowed almost to a halt during the plague years. After the plague, there was a shift in power from nobles to the common people. One reason for this change was a desperate need for workers because so many people had died. The workers who did survive, therefore, could demand more money and more rights. In addition, many peasants and some serfs even abandoned their feudal manners and moved to towns and cities because they were seeking better opportunities. This led to a weakening of the manor system and a loss of power for those feudal lords. After the plague, a number of peasant rebellions broke out as well. When nobles tried to return to the system from before the plague, resentment exploded across Europe. There were peasant revolts throughout Europe, in France, England, Germany, Spain, and Italy. The most famous of these revolts was the English Peasants' War in 1381. The English rebels succeeded in entering London and presenting their demands to the king, who at the time was Richard II. The leader of the rebellion, however, was killed, and after his death, the revolt kind of lost its momentum. However, still in most of Europe, the time was coming when serfdom would end, and we would see the decline of this feudal system once and for all. All right, so that about wraps up for us sections 1 and 2. But like I said, we're going to do a little bit of primary source analysis now. We are going to look at some of these specific articles in the Magna Carta together. So again, sorry guys, let me find out where I am on my notes. Okay, so let's go here. So if you just want to follow along with me, I'm going to start up by reading our little intro up here. So the Magna Carta is a document that was forced upon King John of England in the year 1215 by a group of lords and high church officials, so those archbishops and bishops. The document primarily aimed to limit the power of the king. The Magna Carta contains 63 articles, in which only 3 survive in English law today. Many of the articles we will not explore are only relevant to those who lived in the Middle Ages because of those older traditions. So as you guys are reading the excerpts, so meaning the actual words, the actual phrases that are used in the document, you guys will see words in brackets. Those are simply simplified or modern versions of the words used in the original document, and they're simply there to make it easier to understand for you guys. So again, we are only looking at 3 articles. We are looking at Article 1, Article 12, and Article 39. So for each one of these articles, you have background information and you have the excerpt along with the 4 questions to go along with it. So we're going to start out by looking at Article 1. I should say the information that I have here on the slides, guys, this is the exact same thing that you will see on your Google Doc as well. So some background regarding what was going on at the time, why Article 1 was included in the Magna Carta. King John had infringed on the church's ability to elect its own bishops and archbishops in England. Archbishops are the highest ranking member of the Catholic Church outside of Rome. Only the cardinals and the Pope are higher. Archbishops were advisors to kings, carried out the will of the Pope, and held considerable power over the people. In 1208, John attempted to elect an archbishop. Excuse me. In 1208, John attempted to elect an archbishop who favored him instead of the church-elected archbishop who would serve the church. Tired of the English kings, the Pope excommunicated John and closed churches throughout England. With no churches, the people have nowhere to worship and show their faith to God. The excommunication was reversed in 1213. So your excerpt, meaning the actual words that are taken from the primary document, state this. First, that we have granted to God, and by this present charter, by this present charter, so the Magna Carta, have confirmed for us and our heirs in perpetuity that the English Church shall be free and shall have its rights undiminished and its liberties unimpaired before the outbreak of the present dispute between us and our barons. We granted and confirmed by charter the freedom of the church's elections, a right reckoned to be the greatest necessity and importance to it, and caused this to be confirmed by Pope Innocent III. This freedom we shall observe ourselves and desire to be observed in good faith by our heirs in perpetuity. Okay, so from here, again, these words in brackets that come after a word, that's just a synonym. It's a modern translation for the words that are written in here. So perpetuity, you could replace with forever. Barons is just another word for lords. Okay, so if you have to, maybe read through this excerpt again and simply replace the more antiquated, the more outdated words with ones that you have a firmer grasp of their meaning. In addition, these underlined words, undiminished and unimpaired, those are defined for you at the bottom. So undiminished, not made smaller, weaker, less than it was, and unimpaired means not weakened or damaged. So keeping all that in mind, also considering what was going on in the background paragraph. What is the purpose of this particular article? Why might it have been included in the Magna Carta? Okay, who does it benefit here? What does the church have to gain by including this into the Magna Carta? Those are all things that you guys will be considering when you start answering those questions that are in the Google Doc. Okay, so let's move on to Article 2 now. The background. The king was always in control of how much the people, I think I said Article 2, I meant Article 12. The king was always in control of how much the people were taxed. Generally, he taxed depending on what he had to do for the realm, like fighting wars, building castles, building bridges, churches, manors, or other things. King John had fought many wars to retake the land that him and his brothers lost, and they built excessive palaces and castles. These caused John to raise taxes on the lords, knights, and especially serfs and commoners in order to pay for the wars and palaces. The income of lords and knights relied heavily on how much they could tax the peasants and give only a portion to the king. Now they were giving almost all of what they taxed to the king. So the excerpt from Article 12 of Magna Carta says, "No scutage or aid may be levied in our kingdom without its general consent. For these purposes, only a reasonable aid may be levied. Aids from the City of London are to be treated similarly." So you guys do not have any bracketed terms here. However, these underlined words, these key terms, are defined for you below. So scutage is money paid to a lord to avoid military service. Aid. In this context, aid would be money demanded by John, so those taxes. Levied means imposing or collecting a tax by force. And then lastly, general consent means a group that is in complete agreement. So again, now that you have those words, go back, reread the excerpt, and considering the background, why would this have been included in the Magna Carta? Why are the nobles including this in that document that they are forcing King John to sign? Think about that, and then go ahead and answer the 4 questions under Article 12 in your Google Doc. All right, lastly, Article 39. So some background. King John used every way he could to take money and power away from the lords, knights, and commoners of England. The English judicial system, so courts, lawyers, and judges, had been based on royal judges in traveling courts that solved legal cases. Some kings, especially John, had started to be more involved in legal cases. John would charge lords large amounts of money in order for him to offer justice in particular cases. The lack of rights and liberties for the people allowed the king to dispense his own version of justice based on how much the lords paid him. Some people were imprisoned for long amounts of time because the right person paid the right amount. Some were executed for minor crimes because of the right amount being paid. Again, being paid to King John. So the excerpt reads this: "No free man shall be taken or imprisoned or stripped of his rights or possessions or outlawed or exiled or deprived of his standing in any way, nor will we proceed with force against him or send others to do so, except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land." So if you guys look at the key terms below, deprived means taking away something and not letting them have it. Lawful judgment is a trial that uses laws. This is a reference to previous judges that would judge cases any way they wanted to with no set laws, or they would attack the person instead of a trial. So Thomas Becket and his death, that's a great example of that. He did not face trial. He was simply executed for this quarrel that he had with the king. And lastly, equals, someone of the same social class. So again, like you guys have done with the other 2 articles, think about the background that's presented. Think about what the excerpt is saying. Why would this be included in the Magna Carta? What is the purpose? What is this particular article trying to accomplish? And again, keeping in mind that it is the high-ranking church officials, it is the nobility that is presenting the Magna Carta to King John and forcing him to affix his seal, forcing him to agree with this. Why would that happen? Okay? So after you guys have done that, please make sure that you submit the Google Doc on Schoology so that I can view your responses. We are going to talk more about the Magna Carta and the answers that you guys submitted at the beginning of the video lecture next week. Okay, I do just want to wrap up quickly with a quote. So this quote, excuse me, this quote is from Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was a president of the United States, and he spoke these words, this quote, in his 1941 inaugural address. So meaning when he was taking office. He said, "The democratic aspiration is no mere recent phase in human history. It was written in the Magna Carta." So we talked about how influential the Magna Carta was to English common law, how we still see fragments of the Magna Carta in English government today, those three that we just looked at, for example. But I do want to talk about how the Magna Carta influenced the United States as well, specifically during the American Revolution. After the Revolutionary War was won and it came time to draft the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, how influential was the Magna Carta when it came to the United States? Well, during the American Revolution, the Magna Carta served to inspire and justify action in the defense of liberty. The colonists believed that they were entitled to the same rights as Englishmen, rights that were guaranteed to those Englishmen in the Magna Carta. They embedded those rights into the laws of their states and later into the Constitution and Bill of Rights as well. So the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, for example, that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. This is a direct descendant